3 fake HOA cops thought Eleanor Wilson would be an easy target. The 78-year-old grandmother lived alone in a house that predated any homeowners association. When they forced their way in claiming violations, they didn't know she was a Vietnam War nurse, the widow of a decorated sergeant, and that her husband's 1968 combat knife was still razor-sharp. What happened next shocked the entire neighborhood and exposed a criminal ring targeting seniors. Justice came not with guns or violence, but with quiet strength and a blade that carried decades of honor. Before we start the story, please comment down from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe. The black SUV rolled slowly down Maple Street, its tinted windows giving nothing away as it approached the modest single-story home at the end of the cul-de-sac. Eleanor Wilson stood at her kitchen window, a dish towel in her weathered hands as she watched the unfamiliar vehicle pull into her driveway. At 78, her eyesight wasn't what it used to be, but her instincts remained razor-sharp. Something wasn't right. The house had stood since 1962, built by her late husband James after returning from his first tour in Vietnam. It was theirs, free and clear, with no mortgage and no homeowners association. Just the way they'd wanted it. A sanctuary where rules were made by those who lived within its walls, not by committees or boards who'd never swept its floors or tended its garden. Eleanor set down her tea towel and straightened her cardigan. 3 men emerged from the SUV, all wearing matching dark clothes with vests that had HOA enforcement printed across them in bold white letters. One carried a clipboard, another a camera, and the third, the largest of the group, kept his hand suspiciously close to his hip. "We don't have an HOA here," Eleanor murmured to herself, her voice carrying the soft accent of her Louisiana upbringing. 60 years in this neighborhood had taught her one thing: know your ground and who has the right to stand on it. She moved through her living room with the deliberate pace of someone whose joints reminded her daily of their age. The walls were lined with photographs: James in his uniform, their son Michael graduating from West Point, their daughter Sarah in her judicial robes, grandchildren in various stages of growth. A family built on service, sacrifice, and principles. Eleanor stopped at the hallway cabinet. Unlike the display cases that proudly showed James's medals and commendations, this cabinet was simple, oak, and always locked. She withdrew a small key from around her neck, a key she'd worn every day since James passed 5 years ago. The cabinet opened with a familiar creak. Inside, wrapped in a faded green cloth, lay her husband's K-bar combat knife. Not a souvenir or collector's item, but a tool that had traveled with him through 2 tours in Vietnam. Its 7-inch blade had saved his life more than once, he'd told her. When he returned home for good in 1970, he'd cleaned it one final time and placed it in her keeping. "For protection," he'd said. "Not for violence. There's a difference." Eleanor understood the difference. As a nurse who'd served at the 85th Evacuation Hospital in Canaan, she'd seen enough violence to last several lifetimes. She'd patched the wounds it created, held the hands of boys who suffered from it, written letters home to parents whose sons wouldn't return because of it. No, Eleanor Wilson had no love for violence. But protection, that was something else entirely. A heavy pounding at her front door pulled her from her thoughts. The knife felt familiar in her hand, its weight comforting as she slipped it into the deep pocket of her cardigan. She didn't intend to use it. Most problems could be solved with words, wisdom, and standing your ground. But James had taught her to always be prepared. "Mrs. Wilson," a voice called through the door. "Homeowners Association Enforcement Division. We need to speak with you about multiple violations." Eleanor approached the door but didn't open it. "There must be some mistake," she called back, her voice stronger than her small frame might suggest. "This property isn't part of any homeowners association. Never has been." There was a pause, then a different voice, lower, with practiced authority. "Ma'am, we have documentation showing your property was incorporated into the Oak Ridge HOA 3 months ago. We've sent multiple notices. This is your final warning before fines and potential property liens." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. No such notices had ever arrived. No incorporation had ever happened. This was a lie, and in her experience, lies were rarely told without purpose. "I'll need to see some identification," she said firmly. "Slide it under the door, please." Another pause. Shorter this time. "Ma'am, we don't have time for this. Open the door now or we'll be forced to document additional violations for obstruction." Eleanor stepped back from the door. In her pocket, her fingers curled around the handle of James's knife. Not in threat but in reassurance. Something her husband used to say echoed in her mind: "Trust your gut, Ellie. It's usually right." Right now her gut was screaming. From her front window she could see the men exchange glances. The largest one nodded, and suddenly the one with the clipboard stepped back and kicked at the door hard. The wood cracked but held. Another kick and Eleanor heard the frame splinter. She moved quickly for her age, stepping into the kitchen and picking up the cordless phone. She dialed 911, her voice calm as she reported men breaking into her home. Then she positioned herself where the hallway met the living room, partly concealed by the wall but with a clear view of the entryway. The door gave way with a sharp crack, and the first man stumbled in, catching his balance against the wall. The second followed, camera now replaced by what looked like a stun gun. The third remained on the porch, scanning the neighborhood. "Police are on their way," Eleanor announced, her voice steady and clear. "I suggest you leave immediately." The first man spotted her and smirked. "Look at that, Jerry. Grandma thinks she's scaring someone." He turned to Eleanor, his expression hardening. "Where do you keep your valuables, old lady? Make this easy on yourself." Eleanor stood her ground. "You are trespassing in my home. I am giving you one chance to leave before things get worse for you." The men laughed. The one called Jerry nudged his partner. "Check the bedroom. These old folks always hide stuff under the mattress or in jewelry boxes. I'll keep an eye on Granny." As the first man headed down the hallway toward her bedroom, Eleanor felt a familiar calm wash over her. The same calm that had guided her hands during battlefield surgeries when there was no time for fear or hesitation. "Don't go in there," she warned, but he ignored her, disappearing into her bedroom. Jerry approached her, stun gun held casually at his side. "Sit down, lady. This doesn't have to get uncomfortable." Eleanor didn't move. "You've made a serious mistake. Not just breaking into my home, but thinking I'd be an easy target." "Lady, you don't," Jerry began, but stopped short when Eleanor removed her hand from her pocket, the K-bar knife now visible, its blade catching the afternoon light streaming through the window. His eyes widened, first in surprise then in amusement. "You think that scares me? Put that down before you hurt yourself." Eleanor held the knife with the confidence of someone who'd been taught by an expert. "My husband was Sergeant James Wilson, 25th Infantry Division. He carried this through Dak and Kisan. I was Lieutenant Eleanor Wilson, Nurse Corps. I've sewn up more knife wounds than you've had hot dinners." Her voice remained level, her gaze unwavering. "I don't want to add to that count today." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Jerry's face. He glanced toward the bedroom where his partner had gone, then back at Eleanor. His hand tightened on the stun gun. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Eleanor replied. "Test that theory if you want, but I've spent my life saving lives. I'd rather not take one today." From the bedroom came the sound of drawers being yanked open, contents spilling. Eleanor winced at the thought of her possessions. Photographs, letters, the small treasures of a life well lived, being scattered by greedy hands. Jerry took a step toward her, raising the stun gun. "Put the knife down. Now." Eleanor's grip remained firm. "No." What happened next unfolded in seconds. Jerry lunged forward, stun gun extended. Eleanor, with the muscle memory of someone who'd spent years moving quickly in emergency situations, sidestepped. The knife flashed as she brought it down, not into the man, but through the plastic body of the stun gun. The blade sliced cleanly through the device, sparks flying as it short-circuited. Jerry dropped the ruined weapon with a yelp of surprise, stumbling backward. His heel caught on the edge of the area rug and he went down hard, head cracking against the coffee table before he slumped to the floor, dazed. The commotion brought his partner running from the bedroom, hands filled with Eleanor's jewelry box and a small lockbox where she kept her husband's medals. "Jerry. What the—" He froze at the sight of his partner on the floor and Eleanor standing above him, knife still in hand. The third man appeared in the doorway, his hand now clearly revealing a pistol partially concealed under his vest. "What's going on in here?" His eyes locked on Eleanor, then the knife, then his downed companion. His expression darkened as he raised the gun. "Drop it, lady. Now." Eleanor's heart pounded, but her hand remained steady. Years of crisis training had taught her to keep calm when everything fell apart. But she also recognized when the odds shifted too far. The sound of sirens wailing in the distance broke the tense silence. "Close. Very close." The man with the gun cursed. "We need to go. Now." He gestured to the man holding Eleanor's belongings. "Leave that stuff. Get Jerry up." "But the—" "Now." The leader's voice cracked like a whip. "Cops are coming. We need to be gone." The second man reluctantly dropped the jewelry box and lockbox, contents spilling across the hardwood floor. He grabbed Jerry under the arms and hauled him to his feet. Jerry swayed, a trickle of blood running from where his head had struck the table. The leader kept his gun trained on Eleanor as the others stumbled toward the door. "This isn't over, lady," he growled. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "For your sake, I hope it is." As quickly as they had entered, the men retreated, dragging their dazed companion between them. Eleanor moved to the shattered doorway, watching as they piled into the SUV. The vehicle peeled out of her driveway, tires squealing on the asphalt as it sped away. Only when the SUV disappeared around the corner did Eleanor allow herself to tremble. She sank into her armchair, the knife still clutched in her hand, and took several deep breaths. The sirens grew louder, then stopped. Red and blue lights flashed through her front windows as police cars pulled up to her home. Eleanor carefully wrapped the knife in its cloth and set it aside just as the first officer appeared at her broken door. "Mrs. Wilson?" the young officer called, hand on his holstered weapon. "Police department. Are you all right?" Eleanor nodded, straightening her cardigan with dignity. "I'm fine, officer. But I believe I need to file a report about some uninvited guests who claim to be from an HOA that doesn't exist." The investigation moved quickly. Eleanor's detailed description of the men and their vehicle, combined with security camera footage from her neighbor's doorbell camera, gave police what they needed. Within 48 hours they had names, identities, and a pattern of similar break-ins across 3 counties. The men weren't random opportunists. They were part of an organized scheme targeting elderly homeowners, using fake HOA credentials to gain access to homes and steal valuables. The leader, identified as Marcus Reynolds, had a record of similar scams in 2 other states. His partners, Gerald "Jerry" Dawson and Tyler Mitchell, had joined him 6 months earlier when the operation moved to target Eleanor's neighborhood. What they hadn't counted on was Eleanor Wilson. 5 days after the break-in, Eleanor sat in her repaired living room across from Detective Sarah Chin. The young detective closed her notebook after taking Eleanor's final statement. "Mrs. Wilson, I have to say, what you did was incredibly brave," Detective Chin said. "But also incredibly dangerous. These men have hurt people before." Eleanor smiled slightly. "I'm aware of the risk, detective. But at my age the greatest risk is believing you're helpless." She glanced at the cabinet where James's knife was once again stored safely. "My husband taught me that the strongest weapon isn't a blade or a gun. It's refusing to be intimidated." Detective Chin nodded thoughtfully. "Well, your refusal just helped us break open a case affecting dozens of victims across 3 counties. The DA is particularly interested in how they selected their targets." Eleanor wasn't surprised when she learned the full extent of the operation. The fake HOA enforcers had been working from a list provided by a real estate investor looking to pressure older homeowners into selling properties in desirable locations. Properties like Eleanor's corner lot that developers coveted for new luxury condominiums. 2 weeks after the break-in, Eleanor's neighbor Martha stopped by with a casserole and news. "Did you hear? They arrested Francis Bowman yesterday. Can you believe it?" The head of the actual Oak Ridge HOA was feeding information to those criminals. Eleanor nodded as she poured tea. "I'm not entirely surprised. He's been trying to get me to sell this place for years." Martha shook her head in disbelief. "Well, the whole neighborhood's talking about what you did. Standing up to those men with just a knife. My grandson says you're hardcore. I think that's a compliment." Eleanor smiled. "It's not about being hardcore, Martha. It's about knowing what matters enough to defend." The story made local headlines. Veteran's widow fends off fake HOA enforcers. Elderly nurse with vintage combat knife thwarts home invasion. HOA scam targeting seniors crumbles after picking wrong grandmother. Eleanor declined most interview requests. She had no interest in becoming a local celebrity. But when the senior center asked if she would speak about home security and avoiding scams targeted at older adults, she agreed. Standing before a room of fellow seniors, Eleanor didn't tell them to arm themselves or become vigilantes. Instead, she spoke about community, awareness, checking credentials, and the importance of knowing their rights as homeowners. "The mistake these men made wasn't underestimating me," she told the attentive audience. "It was assuming that age equals vulnerability. That somehow our years make us less capable of standing our ground." In the back of the room, Detective Chin watched with appreciation. After the presentation, she approached Eleanor. "That was excellent, Mrs. Wilson. I think you found a new calling." Eleanor shook her head. "Not a calling. Just passing along lessons learned the hard way." "Well, I have some news you might want to add to those lessons," Chin said. "Reynolds, Dawson, and Mitchell all accepted plea deals. They'll be serving significant time. And Bowman is facing multiple felony charges for his role in the scheme." Eleanor nodded, satisfaction in her eyes but no triumph. There was no victory in others' downfall, only injustice being served. There's something else, Shin continued. Because of your case, the city council is implementing a new program. A registry where homeowners can verify whether someone claiming to represent an HOA is legitimate, plus a rapid response system for seniors who feel threatened. They're calling it the Wilson Protocol, Shin added with a smile. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Well, protocols are only as good as the people who follow them. True, Shin agreed. But it's a start. That evening, Eleanor sat on her front porch, a cup of tea warming her hands as the sun set. Her neighbor's grandson waved as he biked past. Hi, Mrs. Wilson. My grandma says you're a hero. Eleanor smiled and waved back. Just an old nurse who remembers her training, she called after him. The boy grinned and continued on his way, unaware of how close this quiet street had come to becoming another crime statistic. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the shadow box now hanging in her living room, visible through the window. Inside, James's K-bar knife rested on a bed of green fabric, a small engraved plate beneath it reading "For protection, not violence." J.T. James Wilson, 1968. Eleanor hadn't planned to display the knife. It wasn't meant as a warning or a boast. But after everything that happened, it felt right to honor not just the blade, but what it represented: readiness, resilience, and the quiet courage to protect what matters. As twilight settled over the neighborhood, Eleanor Wilson sipped her tea and watched porch lights come on up and down the street. In each illuminated home lived people with their own stories, their own treasures, their own reasons to stand firm. Some battles are fought with armies, some with lawyers, and some, just occasionally, with an old combat knife and the steady hands of a grandmother who refuses to be afraid. The world might look at Eleanor Wilson and see just another elderly woman in a cardigan, moving a bit slower than she once did. But those who knew better understood that courage doesn't diminish with age. Sometimes it sharpens like a well-maintained blade, ready when needed and wise enough to know when to stay sheathed. And in a small house at the end of Maple Street, that quiet courage stood guard as it always had, through war and peace, through joy and grief, through every challenge life had presented. Not with violence but with protection. Just as James had taught her. Just as she now taught others. The following month, Eleanor received a letter from the district attorney's office. The case against Francis Bowman, the HOA president, was proceeding to trial. Her testimony would be crucial. The letter also contained an unexpected note. Mrs. Wilson, your courage has inspired a task force dedicated to protecting seniors from similar scams. Because of you, 17 other victims have come forward. The ripple effect of your actions continues to spread. Eleanor folded the letter and placed it in her husband's old military footlocker where she kept important papers. She didn't consider herself brave. She had simply done what was necessary, what James would have done, what anyone should do when faced with wrongdoing. That weekend, her son Michael visited with his family. As the grandchildren played in the backyard, Michael noticed the shadow box containing his father's knife. I thought Dad asked you to keep that hidden away, he said, his voice carrying a note of concern. Eleanor placed a hand on her son's arm. Your father said to keep it for protection, not to hide it away. Sometimes protection means making sure others know you're prepared. Michael looked at his mother, smaller now than in his childhood memories, her hair completely silver, lines mapping her face, and saw something many missed, the steel beneath the softness. You know, he said quietly, Dad always said you were the strongest person he ever met. I don't think I understood that until now. Eleanor smiled. Strength comes in many forms, Michael. The trick is recognizing which kind the moment calls for. Outside, her grandchildren laughed as they chased each other around the yard, innocent and carefree. Eleanor watched them through the window, these precious lives connected to hers by blood and love and legacy. This was why she had stood her ground. Not just for a house or possessions, but for the principle that safety shouldn't depend on age or size or physical power. It should be a right, protected by community, by law, and sometimes, when necessary, by the courage to say no more. As autumn turned the leaves golden around her home, Eleanor received invitations to speak at community centers and senior groups across the county. She accepted most of them, carrying her simple message: knowledge, preparedness, community. The best defense, she would tell her audiences, isn't a weapon. It's awareness. It's connection. It's refusing to become isolated. At one such gathering, an elderly man raised his hand. But Mrs. Wilson, what if we're not veterans? What if we don't have combat experience or special training? Eleanor's answer came without hesitation. I used a knife because that's what I had. But Mrs. Jensen over on Oak Drive used a security system. Mr. Abernathy used a neighborhood watch program. My friend Martha uses a dog named Tank who barks loud enough to wake the dead. This always earned chuckles. The tool matters less than the will to use it. As the one-year anniversary of the break-in approached, Detective Chin visited Eleanor with news. Francis Bowman was sentenced yesterday. 8 years. She handed Eleanor a newspaper clipping. Thought you might want to see this. The article detailed how the fake HOA scheme had unraveled, leading to multiple convictions and new legislation at the state level to protect seniors from similar frauds. They're calling it Eleanor's Law, Chin said with a smile. Eleanor shook her head, both embarrassed and quietly proud. Laws are only as good as those who enforce them, she said, echoing her earlier sentiment about protocols. That's why we need people like you to show us what enforcement truly means, Chin replied. Later that evening, as Eleanor prepared for bed, she looked at the photographs on her bedside table. James in his uniform, their wedding day, their children, their grandchildren. A life built on love, service, and standing firm when it mattered. She touched the key that still hung around her neck, though the knife now rested in its shadow box. The key was just a symbol now, but an important one. It represented readiness, resolve, and the understanding that security isn't something handed to you, it's something you create, maintain, and sometimes fight for. As she turned out the light, Eleanor Wilson, widow, grandmother, veteran, and now reluctant community guardian, said a quiet prayer of thanks, not for what she had done that day when strangers invaded her home, but for what it had become. A reminder that age doesn't determine courage, that one person standing firm can create ripples that change an entire community, and that sometimes the greatest protection comes not from weapons, but from wisdom. Across town, in the newly established Senior Protection Unit, a poster hung in the briefing room with Eleanor's quoted words. The strongest weapon isn't a blade or a gun. It's refusing to be intimidated. Words to live by from a woman who had done exactly that. In the quiet house at the end of Maple Street, Eleanor Wilson slept peacefully, untroubled by memories of violence or fear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference, new chances to show that life's later chapters can be just as powerful as its beginning. And in homes throughout the county, seniors slept a little easier knowing that someone had shown that age was no barrier to justice, that vulnerability was not inevitable, and that sometimes, protection comes from the most unexpected sources, like the steady hands of a 78-year-old former nurse with her husband's combat knife and the courage to use it. Not for violence. For protection. There's a difference.